Well, a little over 10 years ago, an old acquaintance from decades ago from elementary school managed to track me down through one of my sisters, asking whether I would help with their son's funeral. I think the call started to my sister with, "I think your brother is a priest or a rabbi or an imam or something. Do you think you would help us bury my son?" I met with a couple and I discovered that they had just had two hard hits. Their 20-year-old son had tragically and suddenly been killed in a sporting accident in Pennsylvania in the U.S. But just a few weeks before that, the father had walked away from his family and shacked up with a young girl half his age, actually younger than the son who he had just lost in this accident. And when I sat with them to plan the hard process of repatriating their son's body across the border and planning the funeral, the mom looked at me and told me she had two hard questions for me. First, she wanted to know whether her ex was really going to bring his bimbo, her words, to her son's funeral. And her second question was, why did God kill my son? Told her I'd handle the easy question first. We face a very similar hard question in our text this evening from a very distraught widow. She's given refuge to the prophet Elijah, and she feels that as a reward, as a recompense for that, the young son that she was precious, that was the last piece of her family that she had, has suddenly been taken from her. We know the end of the story, of course. God uses Elijah to raise the young boy from the dead. But we don't want to go there too quickly. The story is striking not just because of the boy being raised from the dead, but because it is the first time in the Bible that anybody is raised from the dead. Hadn't happened before. Never been done. And what makes it even more striking is that this first one who is raised from the dead is not a great prophet, not a leader in Israel, not a great king that they needed on the throne, not even an Israelite. The individual raised from the dead is the unnamed young toddler son of an otherwise completely unknown, unnamed widow from a pagan country known for its idolatry and its immorality. How's that for striking? Surprisingly, while Elijah is referred to several times in the New Testament, and several very complimentary things are said about him, this incident is never referred to directly in the New Testament under Elijah's name. The closest we appear to come to a mention of this is an indirect mention in Hebrews 11 in the Great Faith Hall of Fame. And it doesn't mention Elijah's fame, if we got it right. Hebrews 11, verses 32 to 35. "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life." Now, some link the first part of verse 35 to the second part of verse 35, and they say, well, the women who received their dead back, they are the widows of martyrs who will figuratively receive their dead back because they know that their loved ones who are martyred, they will see them again. But some feel very strongly that the first half of verse 35 here refers to the case that's before us this evening with the widow of Zarephath receiving her son back from the dead through faith. It's certainly intriguing that when James and others might be greatly impressed with Elijah's faith, Hebrews 11 seems to underline the faith not of Elijah, but of the woman who receives her son back from the dead. After we've read our text together, we'll take a few minutes to consider it from both points of view, from Elijah's view and then from the widow's view. 1 Kings 17, and we'll just look at verses 17 to 24 tonight. "After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, 'What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son.' And he said to her, 'Give me your son.' And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, 'O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?' Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, 'O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again.' And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. And the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." And the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, the text today leads us to several intriguing reflections about the widow. First, as I noted, I'm struck again by the fact that this far into the story, we're still told neither her name nor the name of her little boy. Verse 17, still without using any names or other identifiers, tells us that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. Throughout chapter 17 in the Hebrew, there are several moments where the grammatical construction becomes awkward as the text goes out of its way to describe her without using her name. There's a TV game show you may have watched where people try and get somebody else to guess a word, and they have to get the person to guess the word without saying the word and without saying other words related to, without saying. There's moments in the Hebrew in chapter 17 where you feel like saying, just tell us the woman's name. It's like the son of the woman with whom Elijah was staying because he was such a, and it's like, it gets so awkward and complicated. It would be a lot easier for the text just to give us a name, but it seems like the text won't give us a name. It is not typical in the Bible for a character who is so present over most of a full chapter to remain entirely nameless this way. I can only think of one or two other instances where a character appears repeatedly through 3 or 4 pieces of a chapter and is never named. This is not because she's a foreigner. Ruth the Moabite is named. Rahab the Canaanite is named. And both are clearly identified by name. But there are a couple of reasons, I think, why this is done. In the surrounding chapters, Elijah deals head-on with very important people, all of whom are named kings and queens and princes and generals and high priests and other officials, and all of them are clearly named and identified. We're told about their positions, we're told about their family history, we're told why they're important, we're told about the throne where they rule, we're told all of this about their positions and all about them, all about their apparent advantages, but they all fail to seek God. They all fail to fear God and to follow his ways, even though many of them should have known better. And in sharp contrast, here is an unidentified widow without rank, without name recognition, without political office or connection, without important position, without any prior link to Israel, without any link to the law of God, in whom God sees a kernel of faith to which he reaches out. Let's not forget the words of Christ in Luke 4. He says there were a lot of widows in Israel. There were a lot of widows who were as hungry as this widow. There were a lot of widows in Israel who were as hungry as this widow, who had children as needy as this children. And why is it that God sends Elijah to her? Because in the middle of 3.5 years of drought, her faith and trust in the God of the bottomless jar of flour and the endless jug of oil are a sharp rebuke to all those who should have had similar faith and didn't. The God who had spoken to the widow's heart about the mission of the prophet Elijah had surely proclaimed it just as clearly to Ahab and to Jezebel. But Ahab and Jezebel turn on Elijah and try and kill him. In contrast, here is this nameless, heathen, pagan widow. And far from trying to kill Elijah, she saves his life. When the day of judgment comes, if Ahab and Jezebel dare to claim ignorance as the reason for their evil deeds in opposing Elijah, this otherwise unknown widow's actions will condemn them, considering how little she had to go on and what faith she had with the little she was revealed. So the widow remains nameless and identified to make a sharp and intentional contrast with the evil authorities who have position and name recognition, who we know exactly who they are, but who don't respond in faith the way she does. And there's a second reason, I think, for her remaining nameless. As we've worked our way through the Psalms, and particularly some of the Psalms in the 40s and 50s in the Psalter, I've pointed out the fact that some of us give us very precise moments when the Psalms were written. There's some of those where we know exactly what's going on. As the Psalm tonight, we know where David was. This is David. We know where he was in life. We know he was in Gath and Philistia. We know why he was in danger. And sometimes the danger, when we read a psalm, when we have too many of the details, we go, well, this psalm really doesn't apply to me. I'm never going to travel through Philistia. I'll never be in the city of Gath. I'll never be in as daily danger as David was in at this moment. And that's why there's some of the psalms that remain a little more vague. And sometimes a little nameless. There's this line I really love in Psalm 34. Now, we know that this psalm was written by David. And the heading of the psalm gives us a few details of the circumstances. But in verse 6 of Psalm 34, David does something really interesting that always connects with me. David prays this. He says, "This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles." David doesn't use his name there. And the reason he doesn't use his name there is that sometimes Joel needs to pray, "This poor man cries out to the Lord." The story becomes very more powerful for us when it goes without a name. We see this poor widow in need, in her grief, without a name, pleading with Elijah, asking why God killed her son. And we become her. We are the nameless ones who stand before God, faced in the middle of a calamity that we don't understand. And we want to ask God, why did you kill my son? Why did you kill my dream? Why did you allow this to happen to me? The second thing that's intriguing about the widow tonight is that there seems to be this continued growth in her understanding of God. She's not there yet. She has a ways yet to go. But as the chapter goes on, she seems to understand a bit more. And we saw it starting last week. She spoke to Elijah in verse 12, and you remember what she says to Elijah? She says, "As the Lord," and she uses Yahweh, she says, "As Yahweh, your God, lives." The inference is, my God, Baal, is pretty well dead, because I've been in need for a long time and he hasn't done it. But your God, Yahweh, lives. So it's Yahweh. She names him. He's alive, but he's not her God yet. He's still Elijah's God. He's the right God. He's Yahweh. He's Jehovah. He's the living one. She recognizes him, but she's not quite there yet. And in the Old Testament text, in English, you remember if you go through the ESV, every time in your ESV text you see Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. This is when the name of Yahweh appears. So the widow is surrounded by idolaters who worship Baal. She speaks of Yahweh as God, not Baal. And tonight, faced with the traumatic death of her little boy, her statement to Elijah shows that she's understood two more important things about Yahweh. We referred to them last week a little bit. In verse 18, her lament, her complaint to Elijah, shows that she's conscious of her sinfulness and of God's powerful response to it. Part of her wants to address this to Yahweh, right to Jehovah, but she doesn't feel like she's on direct speaking terms with him yet, especially not after what he's just done. So she addresses this to God's mouthpiece, to Elijah, the man of God. She says, "You work for him. You explain to me what he's doing and why he sent you here. What have you against me, O man of God? You've come to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." Now, a few of the commentators, we noted last week, suggested maybe there was some big specific sin hidden in her path. I don't know, maybe she had something to do with her husband's death. Maybe she's not just widowed. Maybe she's divorced. We don't know. There's all kinds of guesses about this. But I think it's possible that through the work of Elijah, she'd come to understand that if Yahweh is indeed the living God, that means that for years she and her family and her village have been worshiping Baal, a false god, and she's coming to terms with the reality of how sinful and how offensive that must have been to God. In the words from Deuteronomy 11 that we read 2 weeks ago, God threatened drought and death as a punishment for the sin of idolatry. But this is not new. Right from the beginning, death has been the punishment for sin. And so her theology is getting close to correct. She understands, confronted with the holiness of Yahweh, that she is a sinner. She understands that the punishment for sin is death. Perhaps through Elijah's ministry, she's understood that this drought that is bringing death all around her is the deserved punishment for the idolatry in which she and her people have been living. But the correctness of her theology doesn't make the question any easier for Elijah to answer. My heart has never quite gotten over the depth of the anguish in that question that heartbroken mother asked me about her 20-year-old son who killed in a sporting accident. Why did God kill my son? Beginning with the way Elijah handles the question, we learn several things about Elijah. I want you to notice first that he doesn't really answer her question, does he? The rabbi's guidebook about pastoral care gives some very interesting insights. I've learned a lot from the rabbi's guidebook on pastoral care. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't confess that in front of a Presbyterian audience. But the rabbis have a lot of interesting reflections. And one of the best pieces of advice they have for clergy, it's actually good for anybody else, is when you go to see someone who's grieving, don't be the first one to speak. Keep your mouth shut. Most of us make the same two mistakes when we come near someone who's grieving. We talk too soon and we talk too much. There's this awkward silence and we feel that we need to fill it. But the reality is that under the moment of the loss, what the person needs most is not gibberish, but our silent presence during their pain. And the loss of a loved one creates a painful hole, a trauma that we want to explain somehow. But the problem is that most of the explanations we give make it feel worse because somehow we infer that the loss of their spouse from the last 60 years or the loss of their little child, well, it's really not that bad and you'll get over it and next week things will be better and you'll be smiling again by the end of the month. I'll never forget standing with my mom at the receiving line next to my father's casket. I'd officiated funerals before, but it was the first time I officiated a funeral that was this close to home. And to tell you the truth, it was the first time I'd lost somebody who was this close to me. And hundreds of people came through the receiving line over the 2 days. And it felt like everyone who came through had to offer some explanation, some reason why Dad's death really wasn't that bad and why we'd all be over it soon. One lady from the church actually told my mom that there was a great upside to my dad's death. Now they would get to hear somebody else preach at church for a change. One gentleman, when he found out that Dad's bone cancer had started in his prostate, assured us that his sister had the same cancer. And I told her, well, unless there's something you don't know about your sister, I don't think your sister had prostate cancer. Thank you very much. And another pastor, as he came through receiving line, told us, well, you know, I had cancer and I was healed with green smoothies made from green kelp and seaweed. Too bad your dad didn't have a good blender at home because he might still be alive. We just somehow want to fill the awkward silence. And often, as was the case with the widow in our text tonight, we feel that God somehow bears responsibility for this death, and we want to defend him. We feel that somehow it falls upon us to justify what God has done, and we need to do it soon before the person irreversibly slips away from their faith. I probably officiated too many funerals and accompanied too many grieving families. In just a few weeks, I'll be officiating my 900th funeral since I've been here at Cote. I buried a 107-year-old Christian woman who died peacefully in her sleep, and I buried a newborn 2-day-old. I buried cancer victims in car accidents, a 14-year-old tired of hearing voices in his head after a bad concussion who decided to stop the voices by jumping in front of a metro, and a local businessman shot by the mafia. In each case, I can tell you this. In the moment of the grief and the trauma of the pain and the loss, nobody's brain is firing on all cylinders. The shock makes it impossible to think straight, so that even if I had the most logical and coherent answers to explain their loss at the moment, it wouldn't do any good because they're not thinking, they're not hearing, and they're not listening. The reality is that life as they know it is over. It feels like somebody has reached in, grabbed their heart, and pulled it out. And nothing I can say in the next 5 minutes will make it better. There'll be time for heavy questions and theological debates as the dust settles in the weeks to come, but at that moment, what they most need is my silent presence as they cry out to God. One of my mentors in pastoral care at McGill told me about his great pastoral challenge in his first few months of ministry in church. In a small rural town in Manitoba, on the first day of school, this couple who had longed for a child for years finally had a little boy. And on the little boy's first day of kindergarten, this little 5-year-old was in the driveway waiting for the bus, and the school bus ran him over and killed him in the driveway before he made it to his first day of school. As he headed to see them and he spoke to them on the phone, he asked them, "How will I find your house? I don't know your address." And they said, "Come to the end of the street. And when you get near our place, you can't miss it. It's the house with the mountain of grief in the backyard." Elijah, bless his heart, gets this absolutely right. He doesn't even try an answer. He doesn't even begin to start to try and justify what God has done. The widow greets him with this angry diatribe, half aimed at God, half directed at him. "What have you against me? Why did you come here to throw my sin in my face, to cause the death of my son?" And she calls him, "Oh, man of God." That should come with an exclamation mark after it, 3 exclamation marks after it. "What have you and God done this to me?" Now, I can think of at least 4 or 5 logical, theological, accurate responses that Elijah could have given her. For example, "Ma'am, when I arrived here many months ago, you and your son were about to eat your last meal and die. You've been alive for the last 6 months thanks to me and God. You've had 6 months more with your child than you thought you would have. You should be thanking me and thanking God." Perfect logical answer, accurate, but certainly not the answer she needed. "Listen, lady, you are a heathen idolater. The punishment of this drought and this famine that the true living God has brought upon you is justified because you and your village have been living as idolaters for the last 300 years, and it's offensive to God, and he's finally brought justice upon you. And who are you to question what he's done to your son?" I can think of about 5 more theologically accurate answers, and I'm sure that Elijah could have come up with a dozen more, but it wasn't the time for that. Elijah doesn't respond to her angry cry of lament. There is instead this tender and warm pastoral exchange. "Give me your son," he says. And then he takes the little boy from her arms. But that's not a strong enough translation. The Hebrew word used there is kach. It literally refers to the enclosed space of intimacy between our arms and our chest. It's not about her arms. There's actually a word in Hebrew that refers to this space here between your arms and your body. In several other passages, it's translated with the word bosom. Our English translations tend to avoid bosom because in English, when we hear the word bosom, we tend to think of breasts, and that's not what it means. It's like a child held closely to a parent's heart, near their heart, in that place of safety and warmth and protection. And whatever Elijah's exact words, somehow his warmth convinces the widow to open her arms and entrust her little boy to him. I think at this point, Elijah isn't quite sure what he's going to do. But he takes the boy upstairs, he lays him on his own bed, and then he cries out to God. Notice a couple things about Elijah's prayer. He never comes out and asks God why. I think he knows why, but it's not the time or the place for that. Elijah understands that his mission here is not a happy one. He's there as a prophet. He has prayed for the rain to stop for 3.5 years because of the idolatry of the land, because of what he knows Deuteronomy 11 says. Because Deuteronomy 11 says that the punishment for idolatry is drought and death. And Elijah knows very well that because of his prayer, because of a 3.5-year drought, there are people who are dying. There are cattle who are dying. By the end of the 3.5-year drought, thousands of people will have died, and countless heads of cattle and livestock will be dead. There is no sugarcoating Elijah's task. But he asks God this: are you really sure you want to bring that punishment, that calamity? He uses the word even on this poor widow with whom I found refuge by killing her son. Lord, are you really sure that you want to do this even to her? I understand the other sinners. I understand the other idolaters. I understand the prophets of Baal on the Mount Carmel that are going to be dead in a couple of weeks. I understand, but really, this woman, You're going to do this to her son. And in his prayer, Elijah essentially rehearses what has happened so far. He says, God, you sent me here. God, you asked me to pray for the drought, and I did. And you sent the drought after I prayed. And then you sent me to the brook, and then you sent me here to this widow. And he says, God, I've just followed your instructions. He says, now I'm here, and you do this. So I can almost follow Elijah's thought process here. Somehow, he just couldn't bring himself to believe that this is how God would repay the widow for what she has done. So he comes to what appears to be an inescapable conclusion about God. If God is indeed the living God, Yahweh, the creator of life, if God was indeed powerful enough to sustain life through the ravens and the brook of Cherith who fed Elijah, if God was powerful enough to feed Elijah and the widow and her son through this jar of flour and this jug of oil that just kept being there, if God was powerful enough to give life, to sustain life that way, then surely if God is also powerful enough to take human life when justice requires it, then God must also be powerful enough to restore life and to give life again when it is lost. Now, Elijah is the first one to raise somebody from the dead, but he's not the first one to think this through. In Hebrews 11, we're told this about Abraham. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham does the math, and he goes, wait, this is the son of the promise, right? This is the son through which all the promises God has made me will be fulfilled, and now God is asking me to kill that son, to offer him up as sacrifice. And the text in Hebrews 11, in a wonderful reflection, says, Abraham considered that God was able to raise him from the dead. And Abraham did the math and said, if God is asking me to do this, if Isaac is the son of the promise, and God is now asking me to slay Isaac, that must mean that God is able to raise him if it comes to that. Now, the thought of resurrection might sound improbable to us in our human scientific understanding, but to anybody who has faith in God, to anybody who understands God as the creator, the giver, and the sustainer of life, what is so unreasonable but to expect that if he can do all of those things, surely he should be able to restore life again. When we gathered Saturday evening past for a memorial service for Justin and Sylvan's sister Lizette, we went to that beautiful text in Isaiah 25. In Isaiah 25, it talks about a moment where on the holy hill of the Lord in the New Jerusalem there will be a feast, and on that feast, death will be swallowed up forever, and the pall of death that has been sitting on all of humanity will be wiped away and removed. I love, there's a striking moment in the book of Acts. It's right near the end of the book of Acts. Paul is going through a series of trials, and there's a number of times where he's had a chance to give his testimony, and he does on this day. And he's on trial before King Agrippa. And with King Agrippa, there's a bunch of members of the Sadducees and Sanhedrin who don't believe in the resurrection. And there's a bunch of pagans who are there who are mocking what Paul is saying about the Lord. And when Paul mentions resurrection of Christ, they're all like, yeah, sure, right. Tell us another one. Yeah, somebody coming back from the dead. And as Paul walks through and explains who God is, at the end of his conclusion, he says this, why is it thought incredible by any of you that God can raise the dead? Paul says, given what we know about God, why should it be surprising that he can raise the dead? If God is indeed the creator of life, if God is indeed powerful enough to sustain life, if God is indeed powerful enough to take human life when his justice requires it, then God must be powerful enough to restore life, to give life again when it is lost. And so Elijah prays. And incidentally, his prayer affirms his belief in the soul and in life after death. Elijah prays, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." Elijah doesn't think the little boy's life is finished. Elijah thinks this little boy is still alive somewhere on the other side. And so his prayer is that the little boy's life would come back into his body. And he uses God's name, Yahweh, my God, let this child's, and he uses the word for soul, the Hebrew word nephesh, let this child's soul come back into him again. Elijah believes that this little boy's soul is still alive somewhere, but has been separated from his body. And his prayer is, God, send his soul back into his body. And it's not just a half-hearted prayer. 3 times he stretches out before God over the child. Now, some liberal scholars think, well, the little boy had choked, he'd stopped breathing, and he'd grown cold, and Elijah knew mouth to mouth, and he gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and he did the Heimlich, and whatever he was choking on came up, and that's how the little boy revived. I can guarantee this. If this little child had a piece of flour or a piece of apple stuck in his throat and had stopped breathing, this distraught widow, I'm sure, would have shaken her little baby enough. She would have brought him back. If there was any chance that there was just an ounce of life left in this little boy, the widow would have figured it out. Now, I don't know how earnestly you pray when you're in trouble, when you face a dramatic situation like this, but Elijah sure wouldn't let go. Tried once, it didn't work. He came back a second time. It didn't came back a third time. Oh, Lord, my God, please let this child's life come back into him. Don't you love the end of verse 22? And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him, and he revived. The Hebrew word there, by the way, is kaye. It isn't just the word for breath, it's the word for life. The little boy's life was gone. He didn't just stop breathing. The little child was dead. Elijah prayed, and the life of the child came back into him again, and he was alive. So there it is. The first resurrection anywhere in the Bible. First time it happens. Elijah had never seen this done before. Elijah had never so much as been told this was possible. When Elijah went to prophet school, when he went to seminary, there wasn't a class on a Thursday afternoon that was called Resurrection 101. Never been done. He simply concluded, based on what he knew about God, that God could do this. Verse 23, and Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, see, your son lives. The woman said to Elijah, now I know. Now I know that you're a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. The deaths that we face don't all end this way. But in the deaths that we face, we place our faith in the same Lord who is able to raise from the dead. One of the moms that we have been working with for some years, we helped her with her apartment and a couple of things along the way. And she told us the great story that she was pregnant with a third child, a little boy. And through the pregnancy, as we worked with her and made sure that she had enough groceries and she was okay, and there are two little were well fed, and that she had breaks when she needed them, and she could see the doctor when she needed to see him. And on my cell phone, I had her number, and so when she rang through, I knew it was her. So I'm in the office. It's about 11:30, 11:45 at night. My cell phone rings, and it's this woman's cell number. And I'm not great at making these calculations. Debbie is normally the one who makes these calculations for me with pregnancy and childbirth and delivery dates and due dates. But I'm smart enough to know that we're getting around 8 months, 9 months. This must be close to it. And I pick up the phone and say, oh, hi, expecting that there's going to be news of the... And it's not this young woman on the phone, it's a doctor. And the doctor says, she's said that you're her pastor. And I said, yeah. She needs you to come and to pray. And I said, where are you? And she said, we're in the birthing center at the Jewish General just across the street. And for 2 days, there's not been a heartbeat. And the baby's dead. And she needs to deliver the baby. And it's going to be stillborn. And she asked for you to come and pray. I had, at that point, been to just about every room in the Jewish General, but I had never been in the birthing center in the Jewish General. So I got there, I had to find my way. midnight by the time I got there, and I had to gown up and scrub and do all the things. And I got into the birthing center.
And this young woman is ready to deliver a stillborn baby, and there's two nurses and voila, and the doctor standing there, and an anesthesiologist. And the doctor looks at me a little flustered that I'm interrupting the process and says, "Well, go ahead, pray." There's not a course in seminary where they teach you a prayer for this moment. And I prayed and hugged the young woman. And one of the duellas, I think, who's African, leaned in and hugged me and asked the Lord to bless me. And I said, I'm going to step out. And as I stepped out, the doctor said, "Go back to your office for an hour or two. We'll call you." So I came back to the office here, and about 2:30 in the morning, the phone rang again. I went back into the birthing center. And I step into the room, and she's holding this dead little boy. And I read scripture with her, and she said, "I need to ask you a favor." She says, the nurse tells me I need to let him go. He needs to go down to whatever happens next to a dead little baby. And she said, I want you to do that. I want you to take him down for me. So I take this little boy in my arms. And as I step out of the room, I can hear his mom start to wail behind me. And I let the door close. And I go to the nurse's station, and I know what happens at this point because I've done it with adult bodies before. With the nurse, we need to accompany the body down to the morgue to clean it and then to call the funeral. And as I get to the nurse's station, she looks at me and realizes who I'm holding. And she says, "Well, come this way." And is about to step that way, there's a code blue. Somebody's in cardiac arrest. And the head nurse says, "Wait a minute. We'll be right back." So it's 2:30 in the morning. I'm standing just outside the birthing center. I'm holding this little infant, now lifeless. And all the staff disappears. And I'm pacing with this baby in my arms. And the grandpa thing kicks in. And I start to rock. And I start to sing. About 25 minutes later, when the nurses come back, I'm singing. Jesus loves me, this I know. For the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Jesus loves me, he who died. Heaven's gate open wide. He will wash away my sin. Let this little child come in. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. We have a God who gives life, who sustains life when it seems impossible and improbable. We have a powerful, holy God who takes life when his justice requires it. But we also have a God of resurrection, a God who restores life, who gives life again. And this is our hope. Amen.